Hello and welcome to another episode of God-Sized Stories. I'm very blessed. I have Alan with me today. Alan, tell us about yourself.
I'm a missionary. I've been a pastor and I've been a missionary. My wife and I started kind of late in life, about 55. I retired from the Navy. I was given a choice when I graduated from high school in 1968. I could be a grown up or be a sailor. So I decided that I'd be only one choice out of the two. So I became a sailor for the next 30 years. And 20 years in the Navy, 10 years as a merchant marine officer, and came ashore in 1998. Became committed in our church here, and in fact, the very church that I was saved in when I was younger, and started working in the church, teaching Sunday school, and eventually became a deacon, and eventually started teaching and then preaching down in the local prison. And we felt committed to the ministry. And then on a short-term mission trip to the islands, my wife and I, seeing the need and seeing the detritus, everything that's been washed up on the far side of the island because of the tourism, the things
Mm,
that tourists never see, like single family homes and prostitution and children and orphans and all of those things. We committed to going wherever God would send us, but praying that he would send us to some place that nobody else wanted to go. So not long after that, one of the fellows that had heard me preach asked me if I'd help his father. And I went down there thinking I was going to sweep the floor and
mm,
clean the windows. End up being called a pastor there for 2 years. And we let them know that we were going to um, be in the mission field. And they were so good about it. And they were so good to us. And I made every possible mistake that a young, well, I wasn't young at the time, but every possible mistake that a new pastor could possibly make.
yeah.
I offended people. I didn't listen to God sometimes. I did all kinds of stuff. And they would like pick me up and shake me off, dust me off, and put me back in the pulpit, and off we'd go again. And then that also gave me some time to take some seminary courses and to take some local courses through the association we had. And then we committed to go on the mission field. So my wife, Barbara, who had been called to the mission field very early in her life when a missionary had come around and spoken to her church, God answered that call for her and gave it to me. So we joined our faith group's sending agency. That's the International Mission Board, Southern Baptist Convention. And we went to a little place called Lesotho in Southern Africa. We're there for 7 years. We had a medical problem, but during that 7 years, it was more schooling. God using them to teach us about being missionaries and the context of Christianity in a native or an indigenous people group. In other words, our people group might be Anglo, it might be Celtic, it might be whatever, might be Saxon. Um, but we worship in a certain way. We worship in churches. We sit in pews in a straight line. But we learn that you can worship God in circles with women on one side, men on the other, and kids running around everywhere. And you had to look in people's faces and you had to walk over to them and talk to them because then everybody paid attention because you were telling them something that they needed to know because everybody's curious. And in that process, learn to preach because I'd never been to a school about preaching. And of course, it didn't pay off always when I came back because I have a tendency to leave the pulpit and go right down the center aisle of the church thinking that I'm back in Africa. Had a lady tell me, she said, the first time you preached, I wish I'd had a roll of duct tape. I would have tied you to the pulpit. And when I left 4 years later, she said, I'll never be able to sit and listen to another preacher unless he comes up and actually talks to me during the service. So it was kind of interesting. But I'm a wanderer,
Mhm.
that's for sure. The we came back after 7 years. We were in a well. Let me digress a little bit. The area that we were sent to in Lesotho was in the mountains. Lesotho is unique. in Africa, then it has no, it has a single border, and that borders South Africa. It's a little enclave within South Africa. It's unique that it's the country with the highest low point of any country in the world, and that the lowest place in Africa is or in Lesotho is over a mile high. So it's rugged mountains and shepherds and all of those things that you sort of don't picture. You see the Masai Mara on TV, but this was a place where there were just thousands and thousands of sheep and goats and few cattle and things like that. And they were unique people. The Basutu were amazing people, but they had a less than 1% rate of salvation. They didn't know Christ. And through interacting with them, and God used them to teach us how to be a missionary and how to love folks and how to come into their life and contextually teach them how to worship God. And we had just an amazing 7 years. Came home because of an illness, was home a year, and then we went to, just so happens we ran into a fellow that was looking for an indigenous specialist, but it happened to be in Alaska. So we went from mountains of Africa to Alaska. And for 6 years, I was the indigenous specialist with the Alaska Baptist Convention, working with all the indigenous people of Alaska. And that's 12 tribes of Athabascans or 12 clans of Athabascan people, Indians, Inupiat, Yupik, Cupik, all just all Eskimos, Indians. It was a wonderful, wonderful experience. Got to travel all over Alaska and meet folks and preached in some strange places and got to like mukluk, which is seal or whale, but you have to dip it in fresh seal oil or it's not very, it's kind of chewy, but it was really, really good. It was better than mouse kebabs in Africa. So
Yeah.
there's that old missionary prayer, that Lord, I'll get it down if you can keep it down. So we used that pretty much everywhere we went. Turns out that my wife was probably a better missionary than I was, but I was allowed to drive the truck, and she was the power and the prayer power and the organizational power of our missionary journey. And she taught chronological Bible story, and then I would preach a sermon on the chronological Bible story and how Jesus was God, and allowed them to come to that conclusion, allow God to work with the Holy Spirit and bring them to that conclusion, and them ask us, well, now we see that Jesus is God. So that's why they say we need Jesus. I mean, of course we would, yeah, that's amazing how that works. And so glad you got to come to that conclusion. You can get 100 Africans or 100 native Alaskans to say a sinner's prayer, but only about 6 of them will have a change in life. And it's those 6 that Holy Spirit is turning their life around, just like he turned our life, just like he changed us. It's no different, but it has to be in their context.
Mhm.
You know, God doesn't make mistakes ever.
True.
And when he made a Basutu, a Mosutu, or he made a Yupik Eskimo, he made them perfect. He made them like he wanted them to be. He put them where he wanted them to be. Athabascan Indians in Alaska are related genetically to Aztecs and Navajos. So we don't know when they crossed the land bridge, whether they, yeah, we don't know when they crossed the land bridge, whether they stopped in Alaska or they went down to Arizona and then turned around and came back to Alaska. We just don't know. But they're the same people, although they worship quite differently. So it has to be in their context. We fit in our context, Anglo-Saxon, Anglo-Celtic, whatever we are. We sit in those straight lines. We play the organ or the piano, and we we sing out of a hymn book, and that's the way we facilitate our relationship with Christ. We worship him through that. Well, they worship Christ really differently. And it's the same Jesus. It's the same understanding that John 14:6 says, I'm the way, the truth, and the life, and nobody comes to the Father except through me. But how I come to you and how I understand you through my context is sometimes completely different. And they play the drums or they sit in circles. They hike 2 or 3 hours to get to a place where they want to hear the message for 2 or 3 hours. And then they want to break, and then they want to meet again. And then they get mad because they say, you aren't feeding us enough. We're not, and you're going, okay, here we go. Anyway, that's been our life since we were about 55. We got called back. We left Alaska in 2017. For the last 3 years we were up there, we were taking a Baptist church that had been abandoned. Everybody knows that Baptists can't get along for more than about 3 years or 4 years at a time. Usually they get rid of the pastor, but in this case, they got rid of each other. They both walked out of the church and said, heck with it. So went down the street, divided into two groups, and went down the street to very Baptistic, non-denominational churches. Relatives, each family owned and operated churches. So we took that building. Our boss up there says, you need to go look at that building and see what we can do with it, because there's some people that want to buy it, and it's pretty valuable property. So we went up to a little place called Tok, which is on the road. When you drive into Alaska, you have to go through Tok. And if you turn left, you go to Anchorage. It's 6.5 hours. If you keep going straight on the Alaska Highway, it's 4.5 hours to Fairbanks. So we went up and we took this church, and we looked around and interviewed a lot of people and talked to everybody from the guy at the liquor store, because he had been in the old church, to the guy at the hardware store who didn't want to go to anybody's church, to all the pastors in town. And yeah, it's kind of weird, but that's the way it was. Everybody in town, and found out they didn't need another church. Heavens, the pastors up there were doing really good with these churches, and they didn't need another church. But what they did need was the training center for indigenous pastors. So we went back to Anchorage and wrote a white paper all about this training center and what we saw that was a vision for this training center, and gave it to my boss and thought it was done. I went back we were chaplains at the Native hospital in town, and that was part of our responsibility. Babs prayed with every patient in that hospital. She pushed a cart and gave them hygiene items and books, magazines and things. And I spent a lot of time in the ER holding people's hands. They had a program called Nobody Dies Alone, and we sort of through that. And anyway, so that was just an adjunct. But about 3 weeks later, my boss came in. He and I were the first ones in the morning, because we had to have a pot of coffee apiece before we were civilized. And great man of God, just an amazing guy. I hope maybe one of these days, as you wander around, you'll meet him. But Mike Proctor, just awesome guy, Dr. Mike. He comes in, he says, what you and Babs did a great job on that. And boy, we really think it's a good idea. But I got to tell you, there's nobody to go up there and do that. So he sort of looks at me, and and I said, what are you telling me, Mike? And he said, well, I'm not telling you anything, but I'm asking you if you and Babs would pray about going up there and doing what you said needs to be done. So over the course of the next 3 years, we turned the church into a mission center, took the sanctuary and built dorms in it, girls on one side, boys on the other, a chapel, took the baptistry and turned it into restrooms and shower rooms, turned a couple of the Sunday school rooms into visiting pastors and their families, sort of family rooms, took the fellowship hall and turned it into a dining hall, and made a 4-bedroom apartment or 4-room apartment in the back of the church. So this was with mission teams helping and coming up and sort of catching our vision and really getting involved. And not long after that, a young couple came up there on a mission trip and they looked around and asked us what we were doing. And I don't know how it happened, but God spoke to us and we said, all right. So we started baiting the trap, and they are now longer than we were ever there. They're doing a great work, working in about 5 or 6 villages, training pastors, building churches, talking to people about God. And it turns out that through that, we sort of looked back retrospectively or introspectively, however you want to. We look back and, God's always used us to just get the rocks out of the field. That's, we go up and get rocks out of the field and then sort of make a fence around the field. And then God send us somebody to shepherd the sheep.
Mm-hmm.
And we gather up some sheep and put them in the field, and shepherds come and take care of them. And we go on to another field to put rocks out of the field. It's kind of weird, but God,
Well, you're good at it.
well, I don't know if we're good at it or not. Been, we've been blessed to see God do so
Yes.
many amazing things and in so many places. And when you met us, Dr. Mike had called us and said, we have a church in Whittier, not a native church, but unless you call Whittier folks, known as Whittiots in Alaska. If you're up there part-time, you're a half-wit, but they joke.
Maybe explain to the audience, because now, and I barely kind of only know just because I visited there. Explain to the audience what Whittier is, because it's a very unique place.
Yes, it is unique. Every place is unique. Every creature is unique. Whittier is on the other side of the mountain. And in the 50s, during the Cold War, the United States Army decided that they needed a base that was a deep water port that didn't freeze in the wintertime and that was somewhat hidden by technology of the day from the other side. So they went to this place called Whittier, which is on the other side of the mountain, but has a beautiful passage to Prince William Sound, and from Prince William Sound to the Gulf of Alaska, from the Gulf of Alaska to the Pacific Ocean. Never freezes. The water doesn't freeze in wintertime. Now, we got 20 something feet of snow last year, but the water never froze. They built a base there. It became a fuel depot, and they built piers. And something unique about Whittier is 100 yards off the beach, it's about 1,200 feet of water. So strategically, it was amazing that you could get these big tanker ships or these big cruise ships in there, and they would have no problem getting in and maneuvering. It's a very, very wide place. And they built 3 or 4 buildings, huge buildings. One of them is the Buckner building. It's where the soldiers stayed, and it had only 3 or 4 stories, I think, with the basement. But it had a rifle range in there. It had a hospital. It had bowling alleys. It had PX, BX, had everything that you need in that building. And then across from it was where the NCOs lived with their families and the younger officers. And there were 10 major apartment wings of that building, but it was 1.5 stories. Had a big club in there and everything. And then down the hill where the base was, they had an administration building and some other logistics things and a radio building. And then they built the BTI, which now is known as the Baggage Towers, where everybody lives. It's 14 stories. It's, gosh, I don't even know how many they've turned into condos now. But to go back, the Army made it this really, really important base. And but as the Cold War was tapering off in the 60s, and the technology of discovering where hidden bases was getting better, the Army decided that other than the fuel farm, they really didn't need anything there. So they civilianized the fuel farm and basically left a couple of busloads of soldiers there to supervise everything. And they finished this tunnel through the mountain that it was a one-way tunnel, and it was a railroad tunnel. And if you wanted to get out of Whittier, you had to put your car on the railroad and go out, and then disembark from the railroad and go wherever you wanted to go. Or coming in, you had to put your car on the railroad and come in. Or you could just ride and then ride the railroad all the way into Anchorage. Um, so it was nice. And it stayed that way until 1920. No, excuse me, 2020. So then they made it so you could drive in. They opened up on the half hour to come in, and they opened up on the hour to go out. And it's still that way. And if you have any kind of claustrophobia about going through the mountain, you'll discover it pretty quick.
It's pretty
Fortunately, I don't.
awesome. I
Yeah,
enjoyed the
they close it, at night, and it's
Oh,
sort
do
of
they?
like. Yeah, I was reminded of. I started preaching before I was a pastor. I preached in the prison, and you knew about the general population of the prison, and you knew about segregation. And segregation is where they put all the troublemakers, and they were all in this one wing, and you had to go through a lot of gates and doors to get to the segregation, where you could just basically go through one gate to get to the general population. So Whittier's kind of like segregation from the general population of Alaska. And there's sort of a mentality about that. In 1964, we had the largest earthquake ever experienced in America, and it was 9.6 on the Richter scale. Really tore up Anchorage. They dropped 17 feet in some areas. It was pretty devastating. And we had a tsunami that came along with that, and that wiped out Whittier.
Hmm.
It left the two big buildings that were built on the side of the mountains, Baggage Tower and, well, three Baggage Towers, the other building, and the what we call the manor, which is where the NCO lived. And it wiped out the fuel farm. So there was no need for any army to stay there. They left, and the people that ran the fuel farm, they said, you can kind of do with what you want with everything. We're done. And they gave it to the state of Alaska. And Alaska said, well, there's nothing to be, there's nothing going to happen here in Whittier. So you guys just, the railroad workers that came and went, and the fuel farm people that lived here. And pretty soon they had occupied the bottom floor of the Baggage Towers, that 14-story building. Now you can't, you have to wait till somebody sells you a room in that tower, because there's no place to build a house.
Mhm.
Railroad or the state owns all the property, and um, what was salvageable, they salvaged, except that one big building, that ghost building that lives up on the hill. And it was so big. At one time, it was the largest building in Alaska,
Hmm.
that they couldn't occupy it. So they occupied the baggage, um, turned it into condos, formed a city, did all that thing. And now, of course, it's got a fish processing plant. It's a day trip away from the most populous place in Alaska. Cruise ships come in 3 ships a week now, but they're building another pier for 2 more ships to come in. It's very touristy downtown, but there's some great trails and great places to go and visit, and see the salmon run and things like that. And there's a church in the building. There's always been a church there. Even when the army was there, there was a chapel. After the tsunami, there were some indigenous, itinerant, whatever you want to call, pastors that
Sure.
came and went. a few that were really dedicated to that group stayed there for several years. And then there were those that came and went. And what got me and Babs to go back to Alaska was Dr. Proctor called us and said, Alan, would you and Babs come up here? There's this little church in Whittier, which you know about. I knew all about Whittier, but we went up there and stayed a year and rewrote the Constitution and bylaws and got some finances back on track and um, sort of building the church back up and getting some new people to come to church and trying to rebuild or rehab a church. And that
Mhm.
happened. It did it. God worked, we think, a miracle. And that occurred. And along came a mission team. And on that mission team was this guy who's been called to be a pastor. And we talked with Clayton, and Clayton went home and then came back and spent a couple of weeks with us. And we introduced him to the church, and the church voted on him. And Clayton's tearing it up. I mean, God is just working
Right.
through him in a magnificent way. And we're down here in Florida, uh,
Waiting for what's next.
waiting for God to send us to the field that needs some rocks taken out of it.
There you
Uh,
go.
I,
Um,
I, I suspect He will do that. We're not
mm,
done yet. So
until you are not until you're the rocks in the ground, I suppose, will you be done.
I suppose. Oh, there's a national cemetery not too far from here. That'll be our next piece of property, I suspect.
There you go. Oh,
So
man.
it's
Well,
been
Alan,
good.
it looks like we're starting to run out of time. So I want to begin the ending by saying thank you so much for being so devoted to serving God. Like, especially as you said, this was your second half kind of thing. Like you spent all those years on the sea being in the boat, and being a merchant marine. And now it's like most people, especially touch on it briefly here in America with our very American mindset, think, okay, I'm retired now. I'm done. I relax. But it's like you took that as an opportunity. It's like, no, it's time to start. Like,
That's right.
so
One of my
thank
favorite, one of my favorite verses in the Bible is in Amos.
mm,
Everybody does intensive study of Amos and takes it apart, But Amos says in chapter 7, verse 14, he says, I'm not a prophet. I'm not even the son of a prophet. I'm a picker of sycamore figs and a shepherd. He said, but God sent me to speak to Israel.
mm,
God doesn't you know, call people that are equipped. He equips people that he calls.
mm,
And our years, we've never been equipped to one bit to go to any place and do anything. But going and allowing God to work through you and allowing God to see, just praying for his people and loving on them. Most
mhm,
people just need to be loved on and reminded that God doesn't make mistakes. And some missionary or some pastor somewhere told you that you can't be a follower of Christ unless you look like me, speak like me, dress like me, go to the schools I go to, and act like me. You got to cut your hair and you got to speak my language before you know about God. But God has a reason for making Yupik and Aleut and
mm,
Athabascans and Boklakwa and Basutu people. And he has a reason for them being where they are. And we go and tell them about Jesus and their context. And they learn that he loves the Basutu and he loves the Yupik and he loves us. And he
right.
wants us to know, come back to him through his son. And it's not a hard story to tell. Um, People
It's
are
not.
amazed. Nobody's ever told them that they could be who they are genetically and still love Jesus. They've always been told they had to change and become like the white guy. And that's just terrible.
Yeah. Well, Alan, thank you so much for all of that. Thank you for sharing this time with us. And audience, thank you so much as always for listening. I couldn't do this without you. Goodbye.
Thanks, Craig.